In the glittering halls of Ravenshollow Palace, where every smile hides a secret and every gesture carries the weight of centuries, a single moment of forbidden contact would shatter the carefully constructed peace between two royal bloodlines. What began as an innocent garden party would end with accusations that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of the monarchy itself. The cameras captured everything, but the truth lay buried beneath layers of protocol, jealousy, and a dark family secret that someone was willing to kill to protect. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Ravenshollow Palace as Lady Beatrice Ashworth adjusted her pearl earrings one final time. Today marked the 10th birthday celebration of Prince Oliver, heir to the throne of Eldoria, and every detail had to be perfect. The weight of organizing such an event fell heavily on her shoulders, not just as the Queen's private secretary, but as someone who understood the delicate balance of royal politics better than most. The photographers will be positioned along the eastern terrace, he murmured into her communication device, watching as uniformed staff arranged tables beneath the ancient oak trees. Remember, no flash photography during the gift presentation. Her Majesty was very specific about that. Queen Isabella of Eldoria stood at her private study window, observing the preparations below with a calculating gaze that had earned her both respect and fear throughout her 20-year reign. At 52, she remained striking, though the burdens of the crown had etched fine lines around her emerald eyes. Today's celebration wasn't merely a birthday party, it was a carefully orchestrated display of royal unity, designed to project strength during increasingly turbulent times. "Your Majesty," came the familiar voice of her lady-in-waiting, Margaret Thornfield, as she entered carrying a silver tray. "The guest list has been confirmed. The Ashworth family will arrive at precisely 2 o'clock. The Queen's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. The Ashworth family. Even after all these years, that name could still send ice through her veins. Lord William Ashworth, her late husband's younger brother, had been a constant thorn in her side since King Henry's sudden death 3 years prior. The man had never accepted her authority, always questioning her decisions, always pushing boundaries. And now his son Thomas posed an even greater threat. "Has security been briefed about Thomas?" Queen Isabella asked, her voice carrying that particular edge that made even the most seasoned courtiers nervous. "Yes, Your Majesty. Captain Morrison has assigned additional guards to monitor the children's areas specifically." The Queen nodded, though her unease remained. Thomas Ashworth, at 16, possessed his father's ambitious streak and his grandfather's cunning. More troubling still, he had begun to attract attention from certain political factions, who viewed him as a potential alternative to the current line of succession. The boy was charismatic, intelligent, and most dangerously of all, he was beginning to understand his own potential power. Prince Oliver, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the undercurrents of tension that surrounded his birthday celebration. At 10 years old, he was a bright, energetic child with his mother's green eyes and his late father's gentle temperament. As he practiced his birthday speech in the palace library, his tutor, Mr. Edmund Clark, watched with growing pride. "Remember, Your Highness, when you thank your guests, look directly at them," Mr. Clark instructed, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. Eye contact conveys sincerity and confidence. Oliver nodded eagerly, his sandy brown hair falling across his forehead. "Like this, Mr. Clark." He lifted his chin and spoke with careful enunciation. "I am deeply grateful for your presence on this special day." "Excellent, Your Highness. Your father would be very proud." At the mention of his father, Oliver's expression grew momentarily solemn. King Henry had died in a tragic riding accident when Oliver was only 7, leaving behind a kingdom in transition and a young prince who still sometimes waited by the palace gates for his father's return. The boy had learned early to mask his grief with royal composure, but Mr. Clark could see through the carefully constructed facade. "Do you think Papa is watching today?" Oliver asked quietly. Mr. Clark's throat tightened with emotion. "I believe he watches over you every day, Your Highness. He would want you to enjoy your celebration." Meanwhile, in the west wing of the palace, Thomas Ashworth stood before his bedroom mirror, straightening his formal jacket with the practiced ease of someone born into nobility. Unlike his younger cousin, Thomas had been raised with a constant awareness of his position's precarious nature. His father, Lord William, had made certain that Thomas understood exactly what they had lost when King Henry died and Queen Isabella retained her power as regent. "The throne should have passed to our branch of the family," Lord William had told him countless times. "Your grandfather was the rightful heir before Henry's birth changed everything. Never forget that, Thomas. Never forget what was taken from us." Now, as Thomas prepared to attend Oliver's birthday celebration, those words echoed in his mind. He studied his reflection, noting the strong jawline he'd inherited from the Ashworth bloodline, the calculating blue eyes that missed nothing, At 16, he already stood nearly 6 feet tall, commanding attention wherever he went. Several political commentators had begun noting his resemblance to his grandfather, the late Prince Edmund, whom many historians considered the most capable royal of his generation. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. "Thomas, we're leaving in 10 minutes," came his father's authoritative voice through the door. "Coming, father," Thomas replied, though he remained motionless for another moment, lost in contemplation. Today would be different. Today he would begin to assert himself in ways that would make people take notice. The drive to Ravenshollow Palace took exactly 18 minutes, a journey Thomas knew by heart. As their car approached the main gates, he watched the familiar landscape of perfectly manicured grounds and ancient stone architecture. This place should have been his home, he reflected bitterly, if circumstances had been different. If his grandfather had been born first instead of second, this would all belong to their line. "Remember what we discussed," Lord William said quietly as their vehicle passed through the security checkpoint. "Be respectful, but don't be invisible. It's time people began to see you as more than just a distant relative." Thomas nodded, understanding the delicate balance his father expected him to maintain. Too much deference would render him forgettable. Too little would be seen as disrespectful to the crown. But there was something his father didn't know, something Thomas had discovered in the palace archives during his last visit. Information that could change everything if used correctly. As guests began arriving for the celebration, the palace staff moved with choreographed precision. Lady Beatrice monitored every detail, from the positioning of the royal photographer to the temperature of the refreshments. She had worked for the royal household for 15 years, rising through the ranks through sheer competence and unwavering loyalty. Today's event would be scrutinized by media outlets across the kingdom and beyond. There was no room for error. "The Ashworth family has arrived," announced one of the footmen, his voice carefully neutral despite the tension that name always brought to palace events. Queen Isabella observed from her private balcony as Lord William emerged from the official vehicle followed by his son. Even from a distance she could see Thomas's confident bearing, the way he surveyed the palace grounds with an expression that was almost proprietary. The sight sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Your Majesty," Captain Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece. "All security protocols are in place. We have eyes on every entrance and exit." "Good," she replied, though her gaze remained fixed on Thomas Ashworth. There was something different about the boy today. Something in his posture that suggested he was planning more than mere birthday party attendance. Her maternal instincts, honed by years of protecting both her son and her throne, were screaming warnings she couldn't yet articulate. Prince Oliver, meanwhile, had taken his position in the main reception hall, greeting each guest with the practiced charm that had been drilled into him since childhood. He genuinely enjoyed these occasions, despite their formal nature. The attention of so many important people made him feel grown up, important in his own right, rather than simply as the heir to his father's legacy. "Cousin Thomas!" Oliver exclaimed with genuine pleasure as the Ashworth family approached. Despite the political tensions between their parents, the two boys had always maintained a cordial relationship during family gatherings. Thomas smiled, and for a moment, the expression seemed entirely genuine. "Happy birthday, Oliver. Double digits now, quite the milestone." "Thank you for coming," Oliver replied, executing a small bow as protocol demanded. "I hope you'll enjoy the celebration." "I'm certain I will," Thomas said, his blue eyes scanning the assembled guests with an intensity that would have alarmed anyone paying close attention. "I'm particularly looking forward to the garden tour." Lord William watched this exchange with satisfaction. His son was performing exactly as instructed. Friendly, but not subservient, confident, but not challenging. Yet William couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas was operating according to some agenda he hadn't shared. The boy had been unusually secretive lately, spending hours in his room with books and papers he wouldn't discuss. As the formal reception concluded, and guests began moving toward the gardens for the outdoor portion of the celebration, Thomas found himself walking beside his cousin. Oliver chattered excitedly about his recent tutoring sessions and his hopes for increased riding privileges, his youthful enthusiasm a stark contrast to Thomas's more measured responses. "Have you given any thought to your future role?" Thomas asked casually as they strolled past the rose gardens. "I mean, beyond the obvious succession plans?" Oliver looked puzzled. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Well, you're 10 now. Old enough to start thinking about what kind of king you want to be, what changes you might want to make." The question was innocent enough on the surface, but something in Thomas's tone made Oliver uncomfortable. Before he could respond, however, they were interrupted by the arrival of other young guests, and the moment passed. Queen Isabella watched this interaction from across the garden, her unease growing stronger. Through her years as monarch, She had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense threats to her family's stability. Thomas Ashworth was planning something. She was certain of it. The question was what, and whether she could identify and neutralize it before it endangered everything she had worked to protect. The afternoon progressed according to schedule. Gift presentations, formal photographs, and a carefully orchestrated display of royal tradition. Oliver performed his duties admirably, accepting congratulations and presents with appropriate gratitude while maintaining the dignified bearing expected of a future king. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed to study every interaction, every protocol, as if memorizing details for some future purpose. It was during the garden tour that the first signs of Thomas's true intentions began to emerge. As the group paused near the memorial fountain dedicated to King Henry's memory, Thomas stepped forward with what appeared to be spontaneous emotion. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "I'd like to say something about Uncle Henry." Queen Isabella tensed immediately. Unscheduled speeches were strictly forbidden at royal events, particularly from family members whose loyalty remained questionable. She caught Captain Morrison's eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head, but Thomas was already speaking. "Uncle Henry was a remarkable king," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He understood that true leadership means serving the people, not just maintaining tradition. I think he would want us to remember that as we celebrate his son's birthday." The words themselves were innocuous, even touching. But the way Thomas delivered them, the subtle emphasis on certain phrases, suggested deeper meanings that made several guests exchange uncomfortable glances. Queen Isabella recognized the technique immediately. Her brother-in-law was positioning himself as Henry's spiritual heir, implying that he understood the late king's vision better than anyone else present. "Thank you, Thomas," she said firmly, stepping forward to reclaim control of the situation. "I'm sure we all cherish our memories of King Henry. Now, shall we proceed to the refreshment pavilion?" But Thomas wasn't finished. As the group began to move, he fell into step beside Prince Oliver once again, his voice low but clearly audible to those nearby. "Your father and I used to have long conversations about the future of Eldoria," he said. "He had such interesting ideas about modernizing the monarchy, making it more responsive to the people's needs." Oliver looked up at his older cousin with new interest. "Really? He never talked to me about such things." "Well, you were quite young then," Thomas replied with a condescending smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps when you're older, we could discuss some of his ideas. I think you'd find them fascinating." This was the moment Queen Isabella realized the true scope of Thomas's ambition. He wasn't simply seeking attention or making idle conversation. He was attempting to establish himself as a mentor figure to her son, positioning himself as the keeper of King Henry's supposed political philosophy. It was a sophisticated manipulation designed to create doubt about her own legitimacy while presenting Thomas as a wise advisor who could guide Oliver toward his father's true vision. "Oliver, darling," she called, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of maternal authority. "Would you join me for a moment? There's someone I'd like you to meet." As Oliver obediently moved toward his mother, Thomas's expression flickered with annoyance before resuming its carefully neutral mask. But the damage had been done. Several influential guests had witnessed the exchange, and Queen Isabella could already see the calculating looks in their eyes. Thomas had successfully planted seeds of doubt that would grow in the coming weeks and months. The remainder of the celebration proceeded without major incident, though the underlying tension never fully dissipated. Thomas continued to circulate among the guests, engaging in conversations that seemed casual, but were clearly designed to gauge support for his implied criticisms of the current royal administration. Queen Isabella found herself constantly monitoring his movements, trying to assess the damage while maintaining her own diplomatic obligations. As the afternoon drew to a close and guests began departing, Thomas approached Prince Oliver one final time. This moment would later be dissected by palace security teams and political analysts, but at the time, it seemed like a simple farewell between cousins. "Thank you for including me in your special day," Thomas said, extending his hand toward Oliver in what appeared to be a gesture of congratulation. Oliver reached out to clasp his cousin's hand. But before their fingers could touch, Captain Morrison materialized beside them with the fluid grace that marked all elite royal protection officers. "Mr. Ashworth," he said politely but firmly, "your father is waiting by the main entrance." Thomas's hand froze in midair, his blue eyes flashing with an emotion that might have been anger or might have been something else entirely. For a split second, the careful mask he'd worn all afternoon. "Of course," he said smoothly, lowering his hand. "Until next time, cousin." As Thomas walked away, Oliver looked confused by the guard's intervention. "Why did Captain Morrison stop us from shaking hands?" he asked his mother later that evening. Queen Isabella chose her words carefully. Sometimes, darling, people's intentions aren't as clear as they appear. Captain Morrison was simply being cautious. But privately, she wondered if the guard's instincts had prevented something more significant than a simple handshake. In the world of royal politics, even the smallest gestures carried enormous weight, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas had been planning to do more than merely wish his cousin well. That night, as the palace settled into its usual evening routine, Queen Isabella stood once again at her study window, staring out at the gardens where the day's celebration had unfolded. The events of the afternoon had confirmed her worst fears about Thomas Ashworth's ambitions, but they had also revealed something else. The boy was far more sophisticated in his approach than she had anticipated. Thomas wasn't planning a direct challenge to her authority or Oliver's succession rights. Instead, he was positioning himself as an alternative voice within the royal family, someone who could claim to represent King Henry's true legacy while subtly undermining confidence in the current administration. It was a long-term strategy that could prove far more dangerous than any direct confrontation. In his own room across the city, Thomas Ashworth sat at his desk, writing in a leather-bound journal that he kept locked in a secure drawer. Tonight's entry would detail not just the day's events, but his assessment of each guest's reactions to his carefully planted suggestions. The birthday party had been reconnaissance, an opportunity to test the waters and identify potential allies for the larger campaign he was planning. Phase 1 complete, he wrote in his precise handwriting. Oliver remains naive but potentially malleable. The Queen suspects but cannot act without evidence. Several guests showed interest in alternative perspectives on royal governance. He paused in his writing, remembering the moment when Captain Morrison had prevented the handshake. The guard's intervention had been more telling than anyone realized. It suggested that Queen Isabella's paranoia was reaching new heights, that she was beginning to see threats in even the most innocent interactions. This could work to his advantage if handled correctly. Thomas reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a manila folder containing photographs and documents he had carefully collected over the past 6 months. Evidence of financial irregularities in the royal household, records of meetings between Queen Isabella and political figures that hadn't been disclosed to Parliament. Most damaging of all, correspondence that suggested the Queen had been aware of certain security risks before the riding accident that claimed King Henry's life. None of it constituted proof of wrongdoing, but in the right hands, presented in the right context, it could raise serious questions about Queen Isabella's fitness to serve as regent. Thomas had no intention of releasing this information immediately. It would serve as insurance, a guarantee that any attempts to marginalize him would come with unacceptable costs. The game had begun in earnest now. Oliver's birthday celebration had provided the perfect cover for Thomas to establish his presence as a serious player in royal politics. Over the coming months, he would gradually expand his influence, building relationships with key figures while carefully documenting any missteps by the current administration. But Thomas had underestimated one crucial factor: Queen Isabella's determination to protect her son at any cost. As she prepared for bed that night, she made a decision that would have profound consequences for everyone involved. Tomorrow, she would begin her own investigation into Thomas Ashworth's activities, using resources at her disposal that the young man couldn't imagine. The birthday party that had seemed like such an innocent celebration would later be remembered as the opening move in a chess game that would ultimately threaten the very foundations of the Eldorian monarchy. In the ornate halls of Ravenshollow Palace, where tradition and ambition had clashed for centuries, a new chapter in the royal family's troubled history was about to begin. As midnight chimed from the palace clock tower, neither Queen Isabella nor Thomas Ashworth could have predicted that their careful maneuvering would soon spiral beyond anyone's control, setting in motion events that would force them all to confront the darkest secrets buried in the royal family's past. The forbidden handshake that never happened would pale in comparison to the revelations that lay ahead, revelations that would shake the kingdom to its very core. The morning after Prince Oliver's birthday celebration dawned gray and unwelcoming, as if the very sky reflected the tension that now permeated Ravenshollow Palace. Queen Isabella had barely slept, her mind replaying every moment of Thomas Ashworth's calculated performance the previous day. By 6 a.m., she was already dressed and seated in her private study, a pot of strong coffee growing cold beside a stack of intelligence reports that made for disturbing reading. Their Majesty, Lady Beatrice entered quietly, carrying a secure communication device that bore the royal seal. Director Harrison is ready for your briefing. Director Charles Harrison led the Royal Intelligence Service, a shadowy organization that officially didn't exist but had served the crown for over 2 centuries. A former military officer with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, Harrison had been instrumental in helping Queen Isabella navigate the treacherous political waters following her husband's death. Now, she needed his expertise more than ever. "Charles," she said as his face appeared on the encrypted video connection, "I need everything you can find on Thomas Ashworth's activities over the past 6 months. Financial records, communications, meetings, travel patterns, everything." Harrison's expression remained professionally neutral, but Queen Isabella caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated genuine concern. "May I ask what prompted this request, Your Majesty? Yesterday's events suggest that my nephew-in-law is planning something beyond typical family rivalry. His behavior indicates a level of strategic thinking that concerns me deeply."
"I see."
"And what level of investigation are we authorized to pursue?" The question carried weight that extended far beyond its simple phrasing. Royal Intelligence Service operations existed in legal gray areas justified only by the most serious threats to crown and country. Queen Isabella understood the implications of what she was requesting, but her maternal instincts and royal duties demanded action. "Whatever level is necessary to protect my son and preserve the stability of the monarchy," she replied without hesitation. Meanwhile, across the city in the prestigious Ashworth family mansion, Thomas was conducting his own form of intelligence gathering. The grand library where he now sat had belonged to his grandfather, Prince Edmund, and its walls were lined with books on political theory, military strategy, and royal history that most people would never have access to. But more valuable than any published work were the personal papers and correspondence that Prince Edmund had carefully preserved before his death. Thomas opened a leather portfolio containing letters exchanged between his grandfather and various political figures during the tumultuous period when King Henry's succession had been established. The documents painted a picture of backroom negotiations and subtle threats that had ultimately resulted in Prince Edmund being passed over for the throne, despite his superior qualifications and broader political support. "The Ashworth name has been systematically marginalized for decades," Thomas murmured to himself, reading a particularly bitter letter his grandfather had written shortly before his death. But that ends now. His father, Lord William, entered the library carrying his own cup of coffee and wearing the expression of a man who had spent a sleepless night analyzing the previous day's events. At 58, William Ashworth retained the commanding presence that had made him a formidable figure in parliamentary politics before his brother's death had shifted the family's focus to royal matters. "The palace has been making inquiries," William announced without preamble, settling into the chair across from his son. "Discreet ones, but our contacts in the civil service are reporting unusual interest in our financial affairs." Thomas looked up from the historical documents with a smile that would have chilled anyone who truly understood its implications. "How predictable. Isabella is moving exactly as I anticipated she would." "This isn't a game, Thomas," William said sharply. "If the Royal Intelligence Service begins a formal investigation, they have resources and legal authorities that could destroy everything we've built. Only if we're actually guilty of something," Thomas replied calmly. "But we're not, are we, Father? We're simply a family with legitimate concerns about the direction of the monarchy and the competence of the current regent." William studied his son with growing unease. Over the past year, Thomas had displayed an increasing sophistication in his political thinking that both impressed and worried his father. The boy seemed to understand instinctively how to manipulate perception and exploit weaknesses in ways that suggested either natural genius or dangerous obsession. "What exactly are you planning?" William asked directly. Thomas closed the portfolio and leaned back in his chair, his blue eyes reflecting the same calculating intelligence that had made Prince Edmund such a formidable political figure. "I'm planning to restore the Ashworth name to its rightful position within the royal hierarchy, but not through direct confrontation. That would be crude and ultimately unsuccessful." He stood and moved to the massive windows that overlooked the family's private grounds, his mind clearly working through complex strategies that he hadn't fully shared even with his father. Isabella rules through fear and manipulation, maintaining power by convincing everyone that only she can preserve stability. But what happens when that stability begins to crack? When people start questioning whether her leadership is actually effective? "Thomas, the kingdom is changing, Father. People want transparency, accountability, modernization of ancient institutions. Isabella represents the old ways, the idea that royal authority comes from divine right rather than genuine service to the people. I represent something different." William felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. His son was articulating ideas that bordered on revolutionary, challenging fundamental concepts that the monarchy had been built upon for centuries. "You're talking about undermining the very system that gives us our position and privilege." "I'm talking about saving it," Thomas corrected, turning back to face his father. "The monarchy will either evolve or it will collapse. I intend to ensure that when evolution comes, the Ashworth family is positioned to lead it rather than be swept aside by it. Back at Ravenshallow Palace, Prince Oliver was struggling with his morning lessons, his concentration broken by confused memories of the previous day's celebration. His tutor, Mr. Clark, noticed the boy's distraction but attributed it to post-birthday excitement rather than the deeper currents of family politics that were beginning to affect even this protected royal environment. Your Highness, perhaps we should focus on mathematics today, Mr. Try, Clark suggested gently. Numbers can be quite soothing after all the excitement of yesterday's festivities. Oliver nodded absently, but his thoughts kept returning to his conversation with Thomas. His older cousin had spoken about their father with such authority, claiming knowledge of King Henry's political philosophy that Oliver himself had never heard discussed. The implication that there were aspects of his father's legacy that had been kept from him was deeply unsettling. "Mr. Clark," Oliver asked hesitantly, "do you think my father had specific ideas about how the monarchy should change?" The tutor's hand paused over the mathematics textbook, and Oliver caught a flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or concern, across the older man's features. "What makes you ask such a question, Your Highness?" "Something Thomas said yesterday, about conversations he had with Papa regarding modernizing the royal system." Mr. Clark set down the textbook entirely, recognizing that this conversation required his full attention. As one of the few people who had known King Henry personally and had continued to serve the royal family after his death, Edmund Clark occupied a unique position of trust and responsibility. "Your father was indeed a thoughtful man who cared deeply about the monarchy's future," he said carefully. "But any conversations he may have had with your cousin would have been private family discussions, not formal policy statements." "But what if Thomas knows things about Papa that Mama hasn't told me?" The question struck at the heart of Edmund Clark's deepest concerns. He had watched Queen Isabella struggle with the impossible balance between protecting her son's childhood innocence and preparing him for the enormous responsibilities that lay ahead. But Thomas Ashworth's intervention threatened to poison that delicate process with political manipulation. "Your Highness," Mr. Clark said gently but firmly, "your mother has always been completely honest with you about your father's memory and his hopes for your future. If anyone suggests otherwise, I would encourage you to discuss those concerns directly with Her Majesty." Meanwhile, in the Palace Security Center, Captain Morrison was reviewing surveillance footage from the previous day's celebration with the methodical attention to detail that had kept the royal family safe for the past decade. The attempted handshake between Thomas and Oliver had lasted only seconds, but Morrison's trained eye detected nuances that would have been invisible to casual observers. "There," he said to his deputy, freezing the video at the precise moment when Thomas had extended his hand. "Look at his positioning, the angle of approach. That's not how someone reaches out for a simple congratulatory handshake." Deputy Captain Sarah Williams leaned closer to examine the frozen image. "What are you seeing, sir?" "Thomas Ashworth is left-handed, but he's reaching with his right hand. The angle suggests he was planning to make contact with Prince Oliver's wrist or forearm rather than engaging in a standard palm-to-palm handshake. And look at his other hand. It's positioned as if he was planning to steady or guide the prince." Williams felt her breath catch as she understood the implications. "You think he was planning to physically manipulate Prince Oliver in some way?" "I think he was planning to create a photo opportunity that could be interpreted in multiple ways," Morrison replied grimly. "Depending on the camera angle, it could have appeared as anything from a friendly gesture to something more intimate or controlling." This analysis would prove crucial in the coming days, as Queen Isabella built her case for viewing Thomas Ashworth as a genuine threat rather than merely an ambitious relative. But for now, it remained one piece of a puzzle that was growing more complex and dangerous by the hour. By midday, the various threads of investigation and counter-investigation had begun to intersect in ways that would reshape the royal family's dynamics forever. Director Harrison's preliminary report on Thomas Ashworth revealed a pattern of meetings with political figures who had previously expressed skepticism about Queen Isabella's regency, as well as financial transactions that, while not illegal, suggested coordination with organizations that promoted constitutional monarchy reforms. "The boy is building a network," Harrison reported during a secure call with Queen Isabella. "Nothing treasonous, but definitely organized opposition to current royal policies." "How sophisticated is this network?" "More than we initially assumed. Thomas has been corresponding with constitutional scholars, reform advocates, and several members of parliament who have questioned various aspects of your administration. He's also been in contact with media figures who specialize in royal coverage." Queen Isabella felt her blood chill as the full scope of Thomas's strategy became clear. He wasn't planning a direct challenge to her authority or Oliver's succession rights. Instead, He was positioning himself as the intellectual leader of a movement to modernize and reform the monarchy, with the implicit suggestion that current leadership was too traditional, too secretive, and too resistant to necessary change. "What are our options?" she asked. "Limited," Harrison admitted. "Everything he's doing falls within legal boundaries. He's not committing treason or even engaging in formal political opposition. He's simply exercising his rights as a member of the royal family to express opinions about institutional governance. But if his campaign gains momentum, it could create significant pressure for changes that might not serve the crown's interests. More transparency in royal finances, greater parliamentary oversight of royal activities, formal reviews of succession protocols, none of it illegal, but all of it potentially destabilizing." Meanwhile, Thomas Ashworth was experiencing his own moment of revelation. As he reviewed intelligence reports provided by contacts within the civil service, Queen Isabella's investigation into his activities had been more extensive than he had anticipated, suggesting both greater paranoia and more sophisticated resources than he had credited her with possessing. "She's frightened," he told his father as they reviewed the evidence of royal surveillance. "Which means we're having more impact than I hoped. It also means we're in more danger than you calculated," William replied. "If she views us as a genuine threat, then we need to ensure that any action she takes against us only serves to prove our point about the monarchy's authoritarian tendencies." Thomas interrupted. "Every heavy-handed response from the palace only validates our argument that the current system lacks accountability and transparency." That afternoon, Oliver's confusion about his family dynamics reached a crisis point when he approached his mother directly with questions that had been planted by Thomas's careful manipulations. "Mama," he said during their usual late-afternoon walk through the private royal gardens, "was Papa planning to change how the monarchy works?" Queen Isabella's step faltered almost imperceptibly. "What makes you ask that, darling?" Thomas said Papa had lots of ideas about making the royal family more modern and responsive to people's needs. He said they used to discuss it often. The casual way Oliver repeated Thomas's propaganda made Queen Isabella realize how effectively her nephew-in-law was using their family connection to influence her son. This went beyond political maneuvering. It was psychological manipulation of a child who trusted his family members implicitly. "Oliver," she said, kneeling to bring herself to his eye level, "your father loved our traditions and our responsibilities to the people of Eldoria. He believed in careful, thoughtful change when it was needed. But he also understood that stability and continuity are precious gifts that shouldn't be carelessly discarded." "But Thomas said, Thomas is your cousin, and I'm sure he means well," Queen Isabella interrupted gently but firmly. "But he was much younger when your father was alive, and he may not remember their conversations as clearly as he thinks he does. If you have questions about your father's beliefs or hopes for the future, I'm the person who can answer them most accurately." Oliver nodded, but Queen Isabella could see that Thomas's words had already taken root in her son's mind. The damage was subtle but significant. Thomas had successfully introduced doubt about her honesty and positioned himself as an alternative source of information about King Henry's legacy. It was a masterful piece of manipulation that would have long-term consequences for the royal family's internal dynamics. That evening, as palace staff prepared for another day of routine royal duties, none of them realized that the events set in motion by a simple birthday party were about to accelerate beyond anyone's control. Thomas Ashworth had scheduled a series of meetings for the following week that would bring his campaign into the public eye for the first time. While Queen Isabella was preparing countermeasures that would test the very foundations of constitutional monarchy in Eldoria, the forbidden handshake that never happened had set off a chain reaction that now threatened to expose secrets buried for generations, challenge assumptions about royal authority that had remained unquestioned for centuries, and force a 10-year-old boy to grow up far faster than anyone had intended. In her private study as midnight approached, Queen Isabella made the most difficult decision of her reign. Tomorrow she would begin implementing a strategy that could preserve her son's future, but might destroy the very institutions she had sworn to protect. The cost of defending the crown was about to become higher than she had ever imagined, but the alternative, allowing Thomas Ashworth to succeed in his campaign, was unthinkable. The game of royal chess that had begun with such apparent innocence was now entering a phase where every move carried the potential for checkmate, and the stakes had grown far beyond simple family rivalry to encompass the future of the monarchy itself. 3 weeks after Prince Oliver's birthday celebration, the first public crack in the royal family's carefully maintained facade appeared in the most unexpected way possible. Thomas Ashworth had been invited to speak at the prestigious Eldorian Institute of Governance, an invitation that seemed routine until its true significance became clear. What was billed as a simple academic lecture on royal tradition and democratic evolution would become the opening shot in a public relations war that would consume the kingdom's political establishment. Queen Isabella stood at her study window, watching the morning rain streak the glass as she read the advanced text of Thomas's speech, obtained through sources she couldn't publicly acknowledge. Each paragraph was carefully crafted to sound reasonable and patriotic while subtly undermining everything she had worked to build since her husband's death. "Your Majesty," Lady Beatrice entered with the day's intelligence briefings, her usual composure showing signs of strain. "The media requests are becoming impossible to manage. 7 major news outlets have formally requested interviews regarding Mr. Ashworth's upcoming appearance." "What's our official position?" Queen Isabella asked without turning from the window. "The palace does not comment on the private speaking engagements of extended royal family members," Beatrice recited, though her tone suggested she found the response inadequate. Queen Isabella finally turned, and Beatrice was startled by the haunted expression in her sovereign's eyes. The past 3 weeks had taken their toll as the Queen struggled to counter Thomas's influence while maintaining the illusion of family harmony that the public expected. "He's going to call for a formal review of royal privileges and transparency and succession protocols," Queen Isabella said, holding up the speech transcript. "All very reasonable-sounding requests that will seem perfectly logical to anyone who doesn't understand their true implications." Indeed, Thomas Ashworth's strategy was proving more sophisticated than even Director Harrison had initially assessed. Rather than attacking Queen Isabella or Oliver directly, he was positioning himself as a voice for democratic accountability within the monarchy. His proposed reforms would create oversight mechanisms that could effectively paralyze royal decision-making while appearing to strengthen the institution's legitimacy. "Ma'am," Captain Morrison's voice came through the secure communication system, "we've detected unusual activity around the Ashworth residence. It appears they're hosting strategy sessions with political consultants and media advisors." This intelligence confirmed Queen Isabella's worst fears. Thomas wasn't acting as an individual with personal grievances. He was building a sophisticated political operation designed to challenge fundamental aspects of how the monarchy functioned. More troubling still, early polling suggested that his message was resonating with significant portions of the public who had grown increasingly skeptical of traditional royal secrecy. Meanwhile, at the Ashworth mansion, Thomas was indeed conducting what could only be described as a campaign meeting. The elegant dining room had been converted into a war room, with flip charts, polling data, and media analysis covering every available surface. Around the mahogany table sat a carefully selected group of individuals whose combined expertise in politics, law, and public relations represented a formidable challenge to royal authority. "The key is maintaining our position as loyal critics," explained Dr. Margaret Wellesley, a constitutional law professor whose academic credentials lent credibility to Thomas's movement. "We're not seeking to abolish the monarchy, merely to modernize it for the 21st century." Thomas nodded approvingly as he reviewed the latest polling data. "The numbers are encouraging. 63% of respondents support increased transparency in royal finances. 57% believe parliamentary oversight of royal activities should be strengthened. We're not fighting against the tide of public opinion, we're riding it." Lord William Ashworth observed these proceedings with mixed emotions. His son's campaign was achieving remarkable success, but the speed and scope of its development concerned him deeply. Thomas was playing a game whose rules and consequences extended far beyond normal political competition. "What if Isabella decides to fight back publicly?" William asked during a brief pause in the planning session. Thomas's smile carried an edge that would have alarmed anyone who truly understood his character. "Then she'll be forced to defend positions that increasingly appear outdated and authoritarian. Every heavy-handed response from the palace only validates our arguments about the need for reform." This confidence wasn't entirely misplaced. Thomas had carefully studied every aspect of Queen Isabella's public persona and political vulnerabilities. Her strength as a monarch came from her image as a protective mother and competent administrator, but those same qualities could be reframed as controlling and secretive. "Besides," Thomas added, his voice carrying a note of something darker, "Isabella has more to lose than we do. Her position depends entirely on maintaining public confidence in her ability to guide Oliver toward effective kingship. Any suggestion that she's been compromising that process for her own political survival would be devastating." The implications of this statement weren't lost on the assembled advisors. Thomas was suggesting that he possessed information that could seriously damage Queen Isabella's reputation if the conflict escalated beyond manageable bounds. None of them asked for details, but the threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Back at the palace, Prince Oliver was experiencing his own crisis of confidence as the adult world's complexities began intruding on his carefully protected childhood. His confusion about his father's legacy had deepened into genuine distress as he overheard conversations between palace staff that suggested serious divisions within the royal family. Mr. Clark, Oliver said during what was supposed to be a history lesson, why won't anyone tell me the truth about what's happening? Edmund Clark set down his teaching materials with the heavy sigh of someone who had been dreading this conversation for weeks. As Oliver's tutor and one of the few people who remembered King Henry personally, Clark occupied a unique position of trust that came with enormous responsibility. What makes you feel that people aren't being truthful with you, Your Highness? Everyone's acting strange. Mama gets this worried look whenever Thomas's name is mentioned. The guards are different, more alert, more suspicious. And yesterday I heard Lady Beatrice talking about damage control and managing the narrative. What narrative? What damage? The boy's intelligence and perceptiveness had always been remarkable, but Clark realized that Oliver was now old enough to recognize when the adults around him were engaged in serious political maneuvering. The question was how much truth a 10-year-old could handle without damaging his ability to trust the very people responsible for his safety and development. Your Highness, Clark began carefully, adults sometimes have disagreements about important matters, even within families. Your cousin Thomas has been expressing opinions about how the monarchy might change in the future, and your mother has different views on those same questions. But why is that such a big problem? Can't they just discuss it like normal people? The innocence of the question highlighted exactly why this situation was so dangerous. Oliver was still young enough to believe that family disagreements could be resolved through honest conversation, but old enough to sense the deeper currents of ambition and fear that were driving the conflict. When you're royal, Your Highness, even personal disagreements can have public consequences, Clark explained. People pay attention to everything you say and do, and sometimes they interpret those words and actions in ways you didn't intend. That afternoon, the tension that had been building for weeks finally erupted in a direct confrontation between Queen Isabella and her brother-in-law. Lord William had requested a private meeting, ostensibly to discuss family matters, but both participants understood that this was actually a negotiation between opposing political factions. William, Queen Isabella said as he entered her private study, I assume you're here to discuss Thomas's upcoming speech. Among other things, William replied, settling into the chair across from her desk with the careful posture of a man who expected conflict. Isabella, this situation has spiraled beyond what any of us intended. Perhaps it's time to find a middle ground that serves everyone's interests. And what middle ground did you have in mind, she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew she wouldn't like the answer. Thomas withdraws from his public speaking engagement, and in return you provide him with a formal advisory role in Oliver's education regarding constitutional matters. He's genuinely concerned about his cousin's preparation for future kingship. Queen Isabella's laugh was sharp and entirely without humor. You're suggesting that I legitimize Thomas's challenge to my authority by giving him official access to my son? That I validate his claim to superior knowledge of royal governance by making him Oliver's political tutor? I'm suggesting that we acknowledge reality, William replied firmly. Thomas isn't going away, Isabella. His ideas are gaining traction with academics, journalists, and politicians who matter. You can continue fighting him and risk escalating this into a public spectacle that damages everyone. Or you can find a way to work with him. Work with him? Queen Isabella stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking. Thomas is systematically undermining Oliver's confidence in my guidance, while positioning himself as the keeper of Henry's true legacy. He's using a child's grief and confusion to advance his own political ambitions. And you want me to reward that behavior with official recognition? William's expression hardened as he realized that negotiation was impossible. You're making a mistake, Isabella. Thomas has resources and support that you're underestimating. If you force this into open conflict, then we'll discover whether the crown still has the strength to defend itself against internal threats, she interrupted. This meeting is over, William. Please see yourself out. As Lord William departed, Queen Isabella knew that she had just crossed a point of no return. The gloves were coming off, and the conflict would now proceed according to rules that neither side could fully control. She reached for her secure communication device to contact Director Harrison, knowing that the conversation they were about to have would change the nature of royal governance in ways that might never be undone. Meanwhile, Thomas Asworth was putting the finishing touches on a speech that would reshape public perception of the monarchy forever. As he reviewed his notes one final time, he felt the intoxicating rush of someone who was about to change history. Tomorrow's presentation at the Eldorian Institute of Governance wouldn't just be an academic lecture. It would be the opening move in a campaign that could end with him as the true power behind the throne. Phase 2 begins tomorrow, he murmured to himself, remembering the strategic plan he had outlined in his journal weeks earlier. Let's see how Isabella responds when the battle becomes public. That evening, as Oliver struggled to fall asleep in his royal bedchamber, He had no idea that tomorrow would bring revelations that would force him to question everything he thought he knew about his family, his legacy, and his future as king. The adult world's games of power and ambition were about to intrude on his childhood in ways that would shape the rest of his life. In her own chambers, Queen Isabella stood once again at her window, looking out at the lights of the capital city that she was sworn to serve and protect. Tomorrow would bring challenges that would test every aspect of her strength, wisdom, and ruthlessness. The crown that had seemed so secure just a month ago now felt heavier than ever, weighted down by the knowledge that its future might depend on decisions she was about to make. The storm that had been brewing since Prince Oliver's birthday party was finally about to break, and when it did, the very foundations of the Eldorian monarchy would be shaken to their core. The question was no longer whether the royal family could weather the crisis, but whether they would all survive it with their principles, their relationships, and their humanity intact. As midnight chimed from the ancient palace clock tower, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another, none of the principal players in this drama could have predicted how far they would fall before the game finally reached its conclusion. The crown's shadow was about to engulf them all, and in that darkness, secrets buried for generations were about to see the light of day. The morning of Thomas Ashworth's speech at the Eldorian Institute of Governance dawned with an unseasonable warmth that seemed to mock the chill that had settled over Raven's Hollow Palace. By 7 a.m., media vehicles were already gathering outside the institute, their satellite dishes and cameras creating a technological forest that spoke to the extraordinary public interest in what had been announced as a simple academic presentation. Queen Isabella had barely slept, spending most of the night in emergency session with Director Harrison and her closest advisors. The decision they had reached was one that would haunt her for years to come, but the alternative, allowing Thomas to seize control of the narrative about royal reform, was unthinkable. "The file is ready for release," Director Harrison reported through the secure video link, his expression grave with the weight of what they were about to do. Financial irregularities in the Ashworth family trust, political connections that weren't properly disclosed, and correspondence that suggests Thomas has been coordinating with foreign constitutional monarchy experts who have advised on similar transitions in other nations. Queen Isabella stared at the folder containing evidence that would destroy Thomas Ashworth's credibility and probably end his political aspirations forever. None of the information was fabricated, but it had been carefully compiled and contextualized to create the most damaging possible interpretation of relatively innocent activities. "If we release this now, the focus will shift from his reform message to questions about his own transparency and motivations," she said, more to herself than to Harrison. "It will work, but at what cost to the institution's reputation for fairness? Your Majesty, with respect, Thomas Ashworth isn't playing by traditional rules of family loyalty and institutional respect. If we continue to limit ourselves to conventional responses, while he exploits public trust and media attention—" "I understand the logic, Charles," Queen Isabella interrupted. "Authorize the release for noon, time to coincide with the conclusion of his speech. Let him have his moment in the spotlight before we remind the public that transparency should apply equally to all participants in this debate." The decision felt like a betrayal of everything she had been taught about royal dignity and restraint, but Thomas had forced her into a position where conventional approaches were inadequate. If he wanted to play political hardball, while cloaked in the rhetoric of institutional reform, she would show him what real power looked like when it was wielded without mercy. Meanwhile, Thomas was experiencing his own moment of doubt as he reviewed his speech notes one final time. The presentation that had seemed so compelling in private now felt dangerously exposed in the harsh light of public scrutiny. He was about to challenge fundamental assumptions about royal authority, and once those words were spoken publicly, there would be no retreat. "The car is ready, sir," announced his driver, a statement that carried unusual weight given the magnitude of what lay ahead. Thomas gathered his materials and walked through the Ashworth mansion's grand foyer, past portraits of ancestors who had served the crown for generations. Today he was about to break with that tradition of loyal service in favor of something that might be more important: forcing the monarchy to evolve or risk irrelevance in a changing world. Thomas, his father's voice, stopped him at the door. Lord William stood at the top of the main staircase, his expression a mixture of pride and deep concern. "Are you absolutely certain about this course of action?"
"Yes, Father."
"The time for half measures and private diplomacy has passed. If the monarchy is going to survive the 21st century, it needs to change. And if Isabella isn't willing to lead that change, someone else must." William descended the stairs slowly, each step seeming to weigh against his better judgment. "And if she decides to fight back with methods we haven't anticipated?" Thomas's smile was confident, perhaps overconfident. Then she'll validate every criticism about the monarchy's authoritarian tendencies. Either way, we win. But as Thomas's car pulled away from the mansion, headed toward what he believed would be his triumph, Queen Isabella was already implementing the counter-strategy that would transform his victory into catastrophe. The game of royal chess was about to enter its most vicious phase, where the normal rules of engagement would be abandoned in favor of survival at any cost. At the Eldorian Institute of Governance, a crowd that exceeded all expectations had gathered to hear Thomas speak. The audience included constitutional law professors, political journalists, reform advocates, and curious citizens who sensed they were about to witness something historically significant. But hidden among the legitimate attendees were intelligence operatives whose presence would ensure that every word was recorded and analyzed for future use. Professor Diana Rothschild, the Institute's director, introduced Thomas with the kind of glowing language typically reserved for visiting heads of state. Mr. Ashworth represents a new generation of royal voices, ones that understand the necessity of adapting ancient institutions to modern realities, while preserving their essential value to our national identity. Thomas approached the podium with a confident bearing that had served him well throughout his campaign. The lights from television cameras created an almost ethereal glow around him as he began to speak, his voice carrying clearly throughout the packed auditorium. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you today not as someone who seeks to diminish the monarchy, but as someone who believes passionately in its potential to serve our nation more effectively than ever before. The question is not whether our royal institutions should continue to exist, but whether they can evolve to meet the expectations of citizens who deserve transparency, accountability, and genuine representation. The opening was masterful, positioning Thomas as a reformer rather than a revolutionary, someone who loved the monarchy enough to demand its improvement. The audience leaned forward, sensing they were hearing something unprecedented in recent royal discourse. My late grandfather, Prince Edmund, once wrote that the greatest threat to royal authority was not external opposition but internal complacency. He understood that institutions that refuse to change inevitably become irrelevant, no matter how ancient or honored their traditions might be. Thomas paused for effect, letting his grandfather's words resonate with an audience that included many who remembered Prince Edmund as one of the most capable royals of his generation. It was a calculated invocation of family history that lent weight to everything that followed. Today I want to discuss specific reforms that could strengthen our constitutional monarchy, while addressing legitimate concerns about democratic accountability. These are not radical proposals, but practical steps toward ensuring that royal institutions serve the people, rather than expecting unconditional service from them. What followed was 20 minutes of carefully reasoned argument for changes that sounded entirely reasonable when presented in Thomas's articulate, passionate delivery. Parliamentary oversight of major royal expenditures, regular public reporting on the activities and costs of royal households, formal consultation processes for significant ceremonial and constitutional decisions, transparency in succession planning and royal education. Each proposal was supported by examples from other successful constitutional monarchies, academic research on institutional effectiveness, and polling data that demonstrated public support for greater royal accountability. Thomas had done his homework thoroughly, and his presentation had the force of genuine intellectual rigor behind it. I speak today not as someone who seeks personal advancement, but as someone who believes that royal service means more than maintaining traditions. It means ensuring that those traditions continue to earn the respect and support of each new generation, Thomas concluded. The choice before us is simple: evolution or irrelevance. I believe our monarchy is strong enough to choose wisely. The applause was immediate and sustained, reflecting an audience that had been genuinely moved by Thomas's vision and persuasive delivery. Several constitutional law professors nodded approvingly at his analysis, while political journalists frantically typed notes that would become tomorrow's headlines. For a moment, Thomas had achieved exactly what he had hoped. He had positioned himself as the intellectual leader of a movement to modernize the monarchy from within. But even as the applause continued, Director Harrison was authorizing the release of information that would transform triumph into disaster in a matter of hours. By the time Thomas left the Institute, basking in congratulations and interview requests, palace sources were already briefing selected journalists on financial irregularities in the Ashworth family trust and undisclosed foreign contacts that raised questions about Thomas's true motivations. The first story appeared online at 2:17 p.m., just as Thomas was conducting a live television interview about his reform proposals. The headline was devastating in its simplicity: Royal Reform Advocate Failed to Disclose Foreign Funding Sources. What followed was a detailed analysis of financial transfers between the Ashworth Family Trust and constitutional monarchy organizations in 3 different countries. all perfectly legal but presented in language that suggested coordinated political activity. Thomas's television interview became surreal as the interviewer's questions shifted in real time from his reform proposals to the breaking news about his financial connections. Watching from the palace, Queen Isabella felt no satisfaction in her tactical victory, only the grim recognition that she had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The information about foreign contacts is particularly damaging, Lady Beatrice reported, as they monitored media coverage. It suggests that his reform movement has been influenced by external advisors with their own agendas for changing how constitutional monarchies function. Queen Isabella nodded, though part of her recoiled at the effectiveness of character assassination she had just ordered. Thomas Ashworth might be a threat to her family's security and the monarchy's stability, but he was also a young man whose genuine passion for reform was being destroyed by political tactics that reduced complex motivations to simplistic conspiracy theories. "Ma'am," Captain Morrison's voice came through the communication system, "we're receiving reports that Thomas Ashworth has left the television studio and is returning home. Intelligence suggests he's in a state of considerable distress. Indeed, Thomas was experiencing the kind of professional and personal devastation that could break someone half his age." In a single afternoon, his carefully constructed image as a principled reform advocate had been shattered by revelations that made him appear as either a naive dupe of foreign interests or a calculating manipulator who had hidden his true funding sources. The drive back to the Ashworth mansion passed in a blur of unanswered phone calls from journalists wanting comment on the financial revelations, and canceled invitations from organizations that no longer considered association with him politically safe. By evening, Thomas Ashworth had gone from being the most interesting voice in royal politics to being a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging established power. "How did they get access to the trust records?" Thomas asked his father as they sat in the mansion's library, surrounded by the same books on political theory that had inspired his reform campaign. "Those documents are supposed to be confidential." Lord William's expression was that of a man who had finally understood the true nature of the game they had been playing. "They're the Royal Intelligence Service, Thomas. If they want access to information, legal niceties become secondary considerations. So what now?" Thomas's voice carried a note of something that might have been panic. "My credibility is destroyed. My reform movement is dead before it really began, and every news outlet in the kingdom is treating me like some kind of foreign agent."
William studied his son with a mixture of sympathy and hard-earned wisdom.
"Now we discover what it really costs to challenge the crown when it decides to defend itself without restraint." But even as Thomas struggled with the immediate aftermath of his public humiliation, Queen Isabella was grappling with consequences of her own. By destroying Thomas's credibility through intelligence operations rather than open political debate, she had protected her family's immediate interests while potentially undermining the very principles of fair governance that the monarchy was supposed to represent. "Your Majesty," Director Harrison's voice came through the secure communication system, "initial polling suggests that public opinion is shifting in our favor. Thomas Ashworth's reform proposals are being viewed more skeptically now that questions have been raised about his motivations and funding sources." "Good," she replied, though the word felt hollow. "And what about the long-term implications of the methods we used?" "That depends entirely on whether anyone can prove that the information came from palace sources," Harrison said carefully. "Officially, this appears to be independent investigative journalism based on publicly available financial records." Queen Isabella understood the implicit message. They had won this battle, but the victory had come at a cost to the monarchy's moral authority that might never be fully calculated. She had protected her son's future by employing tactics that would have horrified the very royal tradition she claimed to defend. That evening, as Prince Oliver struggled with homework that seemed impossible to concentrate on, he had no idea that his family's internal conflicts had just escalated to a level that would reshape his understanding of power, loyalty, and the true cost of wearing a crown. The childhood innocence that his mother had fought so hard to preserve was about to become another casualty in a war where there could be no true winners, only survivors. The game that had begun with a forbidden handshake at a birthday party had now consumed the reputations, relationships, and moral foundations of everyone involved. And still, the most devastating revelations lay ahead. Secrets that would make everything that had happened so far seem like mere preparation for the real battle to come. 6 months after Thomas Ashworth's public disgrace, the Eldorian monarchy appeared to have weathered the crisis that had threatened to tear the royal family apart. Public opinion polls showed restored confidence in Queen Isabella's leadership. Thomas had withdrawn from all public activities, and Prince Oliver seemed to be developing into the kind of thoughtful, well-educated heir that the kingdom needed. But beneath this carefully maintained surface of normalcy, Forces were stirring that would soon reveal the true cost of the battle that everyone believed had ended. Queen Isabella stood in the same study where she had first recognized Thomas as a threat, reading an intelligence report that made her blood run cold. The document, marked with the highest security classifications, contained information that Director Harrison had been investigating for months but had only recently verified through multiple independent sources. "Your Majesty," Harrison's voice came through the secure video link, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of the strain this discovery had placed on him. "I'm afraid the situation is considerably more complex than we initially understood."
"Explain," she said, though part of her already dreaded what she was about to learn.
Thomas Ashworth's reform campaign wasn't a response to political opportunity or personal ambition as we assumed. It was a deliberate strategy designed to force us to reveal the aggressive tactics we used to destroy him. Someone wanted to demonstrate that the crown would abandon its traditional restraint and fairness when seriously threatened. Queen Isabella felt the world shift beneath her feet as the implications became clear. "You're saying we were manipulated into discrediting Thomas?" "More than that, ma'am. The foreign financial connections that we used to destroy his credibility were deliberately established to be discovered. Thomas himself may not have fully understood how he was being used, but someone with extensive knowledge of royal security protocols orchestrated the entire sequence of events. The intelligence report contained details that painted a picture of manipulation so sophisticated that it approached artistry in its execution. Financial transfers had been structured to appear suspicious without being illegal. Foreign contacts had been established with organizations known to be monitored by Royal Intelligence Services. Even Thomas's speaking engagement at the Eldorian Institute had been arranged by individuals with hidden connections to groups that opposed constitutional monarchy altogether. "Who?" Queen Isabella asked, though she suspected the answer would be more devastating than anything that had come before. "We're still investigating, but the evidence points to someone with intimate knowledge of palace operations, royal security protocols, and your personal decision-making patterns. Someone who knew exactly how you would respond to the threat Thomas appeared to represent." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire that might already be out of control. Someone within the royal establishment itself had engineered the crisis that had forced Queen Isabella to compromise her own principles and abandon the fair governance that the monarchy was supposed to represent. Meanwhile, in a private medical facility on the outskirts of the capital, Thomas Ashworth was receiving treatment for what his doctors diplomatically described as acute stress-related complications. The public humiliation and character assassination he had suffered had triggered a psychological breakdown so severe that his family had been forced to seek help from specialists who were accustomed to treating the psychological casualties of high-stakes political warfare. Dr. Sarah Melbourne, one of the kingdom's leading experts in trauma psychology, had been working with Thomas for 3 months, slowly helping him piece together the events that had destroyed his public life and nearly shattered his mental health. What they had discovered together was almost as disturbing as the information Queen Isabella was simultaneously learning from Director Harrison. "Thomas," Dr. Melbourne said during one of their sessions, "I want you to think carefully about the people who first approached you with ideas about royal reform. Not your family members or obvious political contacts, but the advisors who helped shape your specific proposals." Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he recalled the gradual process by which his genuine concerns about royal governance had been refined into the systematic campaign that had ultimately destroyed him. "Dr. Rod Paddo, Margaret Wellesley was the first person to suggest that I had a platform that could be used effectively for institutional change." "And how did you meet Dr. Wellesley?"
"She contacted me after a speech I gave at university about constitutional monarchy.
"Said she'd been following my academic work and thought I had insights that deserved a broader audience." Dr. Melbourne made notes that would eventually become part of a psychological profile that would shock everyone who read it. Thomas Ashworth hadn't been an ambitious young man seeking personal advancement. He had been an idealistic reformer whose genuine passion for institutional improvement had been carefully cultivated and directed by people who wanted to use him for entirely different purposes. "Thomas, I believe you were the victim of what intelligence professionals call a false flag operation." Someone wanted to create a crisis that would force the royal family to reveal its capacity for ruthless self-defense, and they used your legitimate concerns as the vehicle for that manipulation. The revelation that he had been used so completely was almost more devastating than the original public humiliation. Thomas had believed he was fighting for principles he cared about deeply, only to discover that his entire campaign had been orchestrated by people who viewed both him and the monarchy as expendable pieces in some larger game. Back at Raven's Hollow Palace, Prince Oliver was experiencing his own disturbing revelations as he gradually became aware of the adult conflicts that had been swirling around him for months. Now 11 years old and increasingly perceptive about political undercurrents, he had begun asking questions that his tutors found impossible to answer satisfactorily. "Mr. Clark," Oliver said during what was supposed to be a lesson about medieval royal history, "why did Cousin Thomas disappear after his speech?" Mama said he was taking a break from public activities, but the newspapers made it sound like something much worse happened. Edmund Clark set down his teaching materials with the heavy sigh of someone who had been dreading this conversation for months. As Oliver's tutor and one of the few people who had witnessed the entire crisis from beginning to end, Clark understood better than most how the boy's understanding of his family and his future had been damaged by events he was too young to fully comprehend. "Your Highness, adults sometimes make decisions they later regret, especially when they feel their principles or their loved ones are threatened. Your cousin Thomas believed he was helping to improve the monarchy, but the methods he chose created conflicts that became difficult to resolve peacefully. But the newspapers said he was working with foreign people who wanted to change how our government works. That sounds like something really serious, not just a family disagreement." The sophistication of Oliver's analysis alarmed Clark even more than his confusion. The boy was beginning to understand that the adults around him had been engaged in something approaching political warfare, and that his mother's role in that conflict might not have been entirely noble. "Your Highness, sometimes the truth about complex situations takes time to emerge fully. What's most important is that your mother has always acted to protect both you and the institution you'll someday lead." But privately, Clark was beginning to have doubts about that reassuring simplification. The intelligence reports he had been shown in his capacity as a trusted royal advisor suggested that Queen Isabella's response to Thomas's challenge had been far more aggressive and morally questionable than he had initially realized. That afternoon brought the revelation that would finally expose the full scope of the conspiracy that had consumed the royal family for the past year. Director Harrison entered Queen Isabella's study carrying a file that bore the most restrictive security classifications, his expression grave with the weight of what he was about to reveal. "Your Majesty, we've identified the individual responsible for orchestrating the Thomas Ashworth situation," he announced without preamble, "but I'm afraid the discovery raises questions that go far beyond this specific crisis." Queen Isabella braced herself for news that she suspected would be worse than anything she had imagined. Who was it? Lady Beatrice Thornfield. The name hit Queen Isabella like a physical blow. Lady Beatrice, her private secretary, and one of her most trusted advisors for over a decade, had engineered the entire crisis that had nearly destroyed the monarchy's reputation for fair governance. "That's impossible," she said weakly. "Beatrice has been completely loyal. She helped me respond to Thomas's challenge. She coordinated the intelligence operations that discredited him, which gave her perfect cover for ensuring that our response was exactly as aggressive and morally compromising as she wanted it to be," Harrison explained. "Lady Beatrice has been in contact with Republican political organizations for over 2 years, feeding them intelligence about royal operations and helping them develop strategies for undermining public confidence in the monarchy. The evidence was overwhelming and devastating. Financial records showed payments from organizations dedicated to abolishing constitutional monarchy. Communication logs revealed systematic breaches of royal security that had provided anti-monarchist groups with detailed information about palace operations. Most damaging of all, transcripts showed that Lady Beatrice had helped design Thomas's reform campaign specifically to provoke the kind of authoritarian response that would damage the crown's moral authority. She used Thomas as a tool to force us to reveal our capacity for political ruthlessness," Queen Isabella said, the full scope of the betrayal finally becoming clear. "She knew I would authorize intelligence operations to protect Oliver, and she counted on those operations to discredit the monarchy's claims to represent fair and democratic governance." "Yes, ma'am, and there's more. Lady Beatrice has been documenting every aggressive action we've taken in response to perceived threats, building a comprehensive case that the monarchy has become an authoritarian institution that maintains power through surveillance and character assassination." The room fell silent as Queen Isabella contemplated the magnitude of what had been done to her family and her institution. She had been so focused on protecting Oliver and preserving royal authority that she had failed to recognize the enemy within her own household. Lady Beatrice had been perfectly positioned to manipulate both the challenges and the responses, creating a crisis that would damage the monarchy regardless of how it was resolved.
"Where is she now?" Queen Isabella asked.
"Gone. She submitted her resignation yesterday and has apparently left the country. Our sources suggest she's already begun sharing her documentation with international media organizations that specialize in exposing abuses by powerful institutions." The implications were staggering. Within days, possibly hours, the world's media would have access to detailed information about royal intelligence operations, political manipulation tactics, and the personal decision-making processes that had led Queen Isabella to abandon the principles of fair governance that the monarchy was supposed to represent. Your Majesty, Harrison continued gently, there's something else you need to know. Prince Oliver has been asking his tutors detailed questions about the Thomas Ashworth situation. He's beginning to understand that something significant happened, and he's asking specifically about your role in whatever that something was. Queen Isabella felt the final pieces of her carefully constructed world collapse around her. She had sacrificed her principles to protect her son, only to discover that she had been manipulated into taking actions that would ultimately teach him the worst possible lessons about power, loyalty, and the true cost of wearing a crown. That evening, as Queen Isabella prepared to have the most difficult conversation of her reign, Prince Oliver was struggling with homework that seemed impossible to focus on as adult voices drifted through the palace corridors, discussing crisis management and damage control in hushed tones that suggested something terrible was about to happen. The game that had begun with an innocent birthday party had revealed truths about power, corruption, and betrayal that would reshape everyone's understanding of what it meant to serve the crown. Thomas Ashworth had been destroyed for crimes he didn't fully understand. He was calm.